Was Robin Hood real, or did medieval England need him to be nobody? In the next minutes, we'll trace how a name that appears in 14th century ballads and court nicknames became a moving target by design. If one man could be arrested, a legend could not. Stay with me as we unpack why Robin Hood operated like a safety valve under brutal forest laws and heavy taxation, and how historians like Holt and Knight show that a composite outlaw wasn't a historical failure. It was a cultural strategy for survival. Chapter 1. The forest was a courtroom without appeal. Medieval courts promised order, but for many people, the law they actually faced lived beneath the trees. Royal forest law divided the land in ways villagers could not always see. Huge areas were declared the king's private preserve. Inside these zones, the crown claimed the deer, the boar, the oak trees, the beech nuts, and even the grass underfoot. A man could own a cottage at the forest edge and still be guilty of trespass for cutting a branch to survive the winter. These rules did not come from village assemblies or long-standing custom. They came directly from royal authority, turning the forest into a separate legal world, with its own language, officers, and punishments. Under this system, everyday survival became a legal risk. Setting a snare could be treated as an attack on the king's game. Collecting fallen wood could be charged as timber theft. Letting a cow graze could lead to accusations of illegal pasturing. Penalties escalated quickly. Fines that erased months of labor, imprisonment, or physical punishment. Hands taken, eyes lost. Recorded as the cost of breaking the peace of the forest. The logic was brutal but clear. If the king's animals moved freely, the king's authority appeared unchallenged. Enforcement did not follow village rhythms. Wardens governed vast forest districts on the crown's behalf. Verderers, drawn from the local gentry, presided over forest courts, judging crimes against vert and venison, plants and game, and recording accusations from sworn jurors. Foresters patrolled paths, marked trees, counted deer, and seized traps. Their power bypassed informal compromise. Where a village official might look away when a widow gathered sticks, a forester could still prosecute. The forest became a legal island inside the county, with its own courts, attachments, regard, swainmotes, and the severe justice seat, where verdicts produced both control and revenue. Money flowed through this system. Fines filled royal coffers. Licenses to pasture pigs, cut timber or hunt were granted as favors or sold at high cost. Offices themselves were rewards that tied minor nobles to royal service. In hard times, bad winters or rising taxes, the screws tightened. Patrols increased, mercy shrank, and the forest shifted from shared resource to written ledger. One record tells of a smallholder accused after a deer wandered into a snare meant for rabbits. He never killed the animal. The forester found the marks, and the man was brought before the swainmote. Unable to pay the fine, he lost his tools, then his ox, and spent weeks in custody while his family fell into debt. No song remembers his name. His neighbors remembered the forester's horse. Yet the forest also attracted those the law hunted. Dense cover, winding paths, and blurred borders offered escape. A man chased through village lanes could disappear among trees and heath. Hidden camps could watch the roads that carried rents and taxes. The same woods that empowered officials also protected fugitives. The contradiction sharpened. The forest hunted, and the forest hid. Under such conditions, justice had to appear somewhere other than a bench. If courts punished hunger as crime, stories could rebalance the scales. A nameless helper emerged from the trees, fed the poor, shamed corrupt officers, and vanished again was safer than open defiance. These tales could circulate without naming anyone who might be seized at dawn. The forest became a stage for moral judgment precisely because its formal law felt inhuman. If an oak could outweigh a peasant stove, then a story could restore balance. That is why the anonymous outlaw mattered. The harsher the penalties and the tighter the net, the more useful it became to keep the champion unfixed. He could be many voices or none at all. He could move within forest rules while answering to another code, help the poor, expose greed, repay cruelty with wit, and cross boundaries without leaving records behind. The legend worked like a shadow court, delivering verdicts the official courts ignored. From these punitive woods, people began to hum songs that treated trees as jurors and clearings as courts, carrying them from hearth to road and back again. The next step is to hear how those songs taught the rules of that hidden law. Chapter 2. When a name becomes a mask. Names become dangerous when the law is alert, so a name that anyone can wear becomes a tool. By the 14th century, clerks begin writing Robin Hood in margins and court rolls not as a family name, but as shorthand for a certain kind of offender. Legal notes and civic lists show it appearing across different counties with no clear connection between one bearer and the next. The records treat it less as an identity and more as a label, used when someone lived by the bough and stayed beyond easy capture. That scattered pattern matters. A robin appears in one county during a year of heavy taxation, then another surfaces far away a decade later. The repetition makes it hard to believe in a single life, yet consistent enough to suggest a shared meaning. The name also attaches itself to the landscape. Wells, bays, cliffs and caves take on the name Robin Hood, folding it into local memory. A well near Skelbrook carries it. A bay on the Yorkshire coast bears it. Northern crags and caves adopt it too. The spread is wide and early, with the famous link to Sherwood becoming dominant only later. This looks less like inheritance and more like diffusion. Records hint at how the name functioned. One clerk writes Robin Hood, without listing of father or manor, as if the word alone explains the situation. Another notes the alias beside a minor offence and moves on, offering no pedigree and no attempt to tie the man to land. In each case, the term signals a way of life, hidden, mobile, and difficult to prosecute. The dates do not form a biography, they form a dotted map. Oral tradition carries that map further. A reusable name allows stories to travel. When a tale moves from one market town to another, a familiar handle helps people remember it, repeat it, and adapt it. Singers can swap Barnsdale for the nearest forest, replace an abbot with a local prior, and keep the same anchor, Robin Hood. The alias holds the story together while details change. That is how tales keep pace with roads, fairs, and shifting grievances. Elite identities work differently. A noble's name was bound to charters, seals, witnesses, and parcels of land. Those records fix people to places and dates. Outlaws had no such archive. They needed names they could pick up and put down, cloaks for movement rather than badges for court. The mask did not need ancestry, it needed mobility. What mattered was not lineage, but whether the name signaled the right values, aid the weak, shame the greedy, disappear before dawn. That portability protected both storytellers and targets. A ballad praising Robin Hood criticizes behavior, not a neighbor. It condemns a corrupt sheriff without pointing to the man holding the keys. If authorities asked who began the singing, the answer dissolved into mist. No one in particular, and everyone who needed it. The name absorbed danger. The people remained hard to seize. In times of crackdowns, a floating hero offered cover. Critique could pass as entertainment, without naming a leader who could be dragged before a bench. Some readers see this multiplicity as a flaw to resolve. They search for an origin point, a first appearance, a single spark. But the mismatched dates and places do more than frustrate that search. They reveal purpose. A mask many can wear fits a world where punishment is swift and records are thin. The legend does not fail by refusing to collapse into one biography. It succeeds because it can absorb many lives and still deliver the same judgment. Think of the name as a small technology. It compresses meaning, resistance to predation, a code of fair dealing, into two familiar words. It reduces risk by blurring identity. It allows stories to cross counties, decades, and changes in power. Place names mark its passage on the land. Court records show it circulating in official language. Songs carry it from gathering to gathering, reshaped to local needs. Once the mask took hold, it gave storytellers a platform. Records show how the name moved. Ballads show what it was meant to do. Now we can step into those early verses and watch how a simple label became a working code of judgment, mercy, and wit. Chapter 3. Ballads as blueprints, not biographies. The earliest Robin Hood ballads offer guidance, not timelines. They teach listeners how the outlaw behaves, who deserves help, and who deserves judgment. Titles survive in the record, a jest of Robin Hood and the monk among the earliest written versions. But their purpose is not to record when events happened. Their purpose is to show what justice looks like when authority takes more than it gives. A monk lies, a sheriff exploits, a traveller meets a stranger in green. The stories repeat the ethical test and ignore the date. Take The Guest. Set mainly in Barnesdale, it presents Robin as a yeoman, a free commoner with status but no title. A knight arrives burdened by debt and close to ruin. Robin demands honesty, measures the truth, and then pays the debt. This is not a historical episode. It is a rule in action. Later, a wealthy churchman appears and lies about his purse. The result is reversed. The purse is opened and the wealth is shared. The sequence teaches listeners how to judge honesty, wealth, need, and consequence. Every step, who speaks first, swears, who pays, signals the code. Robin Hood and the monk narrows the focus and sharpens loyalty. A dispute and an arrest force the band to respond. The rescue depends on speed, coordination, and risk taken for a companion. Again, no date anchors the scene. What anchors it is obligation. A leader protects his own, and the band enforces its rules. The sheriff loses not because he is a specific historical man, but because he represents a pattern of power that abuses custody. Across the early ballads, settings shift between Barnesdale and Sherwood, and Robin's social rank changes in later retellings. Yet the moral framework remains stable. Early texts emphasize the yeoman identity and northern landscapes, grounding the stories among working men who value straight shooting and fair accounts. Later versions dress Robin as a dispossessed noble and relocate him to Sherwood, but the original blueprint still shows through. Test the stranger, feed the honest poor, expose hypocrisy, and stand by your companions. Certain scenes repeat because they define justice in motion. Ambush becomes an audit on the road. Hospitality separates need from greed. Debt relief turns surplus into stability bound by oaths. Disguises, potter, monk, or other roles, use deception against those who exploit office. In each case, risk and wealth are redistributed toward fairness as the audience understands it. The ballads linger on the mechanics of judgment. The questions asked, the sums counted, the oath sworn, the penalty applied. The guest's money seen makes this system visible. The knight states his debt. Robin demands the exact amount. Payment is counted carefully, terms discussed. Charity depends on truth and is enforced by reputation and force if needed. When a lying churchman later claims poverty, the process reverses. Hidden coins are exposed. The lesson is precise. Honesty earns credit. Deceit invites seizure. Ritual and arithmetic make justice legible to listeners who know the weight of a reckoning. These patterns endure because of how the songs were made. Performers carried them from market to manor, using stock phrases and familiar scenes. Oral storytelling favors repeatable structures over fixed facts. Place names can change, prices can shift, and villains can swap roles without breaking the lesson. The moral signals stay intact as the setting adapts. Seen this way, the ballads are tools. They teach how to resist officials who misuse power. They offer a method for judging need and punishing fraud without a judge in scarlet robes. They train listeners to think about credit, loyalty, and authority in a world where paperwork and office can destroy the unprotected. If biography mattered most, the songs would fix Robin in one berth and one place. Instead, they preserve the tests, the rules, and the outcomes. That is the point. Early Robin Hood is a portable ethic with a familiar face. Dates fade, but the code travels intact. And once that code settled into habit, it met the pressures of taxes, tithes, and officials with ledgers, conditions that made the blueprint feel less like entertainment and more like instruction. Chapter 4. Tax, Tithe, and the Sheriff's Hand. When debts and dues rise faster than harvests, an outlaw can start to look like a public service. Royal government demanded money on a steady cycle. Lay subsidies on movable goods, tallages imposed on towns for quick cash, and scutage paid instead of military service. Lords added their own claims, reliefs, heriots, labour duties. The church stood alongside them, taking a tenth of produce as tithe, plus fees for rights and rents on church lands. None of these demands paused when weather failed or prices fell. Sheriffs stood at the centre of this system. They read royal writs, assembled juries, pressured collectors, and turned unpaid sums into seizures. Their performance was judged by what they delivered to the exchequer, giving them every reason to push hard. Economic shocks made bad years worse. War drained labour and coin from farms and workshops. Poor harvests drove up grain prices and forced families into debt. Levies still arrived, calculated from assessment lists written months earlier. A craftsman who sold fewer goods owed the same share of his tools. A smallholder who lost a cow still owed the same tithe on his thin harvest. Towns that fell behind risked losing their privileges. Villages that missed payments faced officials arriving with carts and keys. This is why the ballads focus on sheriffs and abbots. In everyday life, they were the visible hands of extraction. Sheriffs controlled juries and fines and could turn legal process into revenue. Abbots managed estates, charged for mills and pasture, and traded wool at scales that shaped local markets. When songs stage encounters with a churchman heavy with silver, or a sheriff riding to collect, they are not inventing villains. They are naming familiar pressures. A robin who stops a purse on the road reads not as random theft, but as a correction against officials who never accepted refusal. Surviving records echo the same patterns. Town complaints describe officers taking bribes to speed cases, sheriffs stacking juries with allies, abbey agents squeezing extra fees. A notorious collector could be recognized by his full purse and fast horse. When a clerk notes trouble involving a man labeled with a generic outlaw name, listeners already understand the role. Names change by county. The structure stays the same. Debt locked people into this system. A failed harvest forced tenants to borrow grain or money, often from the very officials who enforced payment. Fees and interest turned short-term need into long-term obligation. Missed payments led to distraint. Doors shut, goods seized, families pressured. Sanctuary offered one of the few legal escapes. A fugitive might claim temporary protection in a church or abandon the realm entirely. Between law and mercy, informal support networks grew. Someone who knew forest paths, a widow with spare bread, a smith willing to mend a buckle. Resistance survived without open revolt. The numbers explain the strain. A lay subsidy might claim a 10th or 15th of movable wealth. The tithe took another 10th before produce reached market. In a year when yields fell by a quarter, those fixed shares cut far deeper. Sheriffs did not reduce the king's portion because barley failed. Abbots did not waive rents because lambs were lost. The arithmetic appeared in empty cupboards and pawned tools. In such conditions, a figure who interrupts a sheriff's convoy, forces an abbot to open his coffer, or pays a debtor's bond with seized funds, gains public value. People can praise the outcome without admitting rebellion. A ballad spreads that approval without naming a neighbor. A single, fixed leader could be captured and silenced. A mask that shifts from county to county cannot be broken by one rope. That is the quiet reason the legend endured. Economic pressure made a rotating, nameless champion believable and safer to admire aloud. Each telling repeats the same lesson. A code that restrains extraction and rewards fair dealing serves the community better than fear. With that foundation laid, it is natural to ask whether one man stood behind the mask, and why historians keep testing names against the record. Chapter 5. The Men Behind the Mask. If we search for a single historical face behind the legend, a few names step forward from the records. There is Robert Hood of Wakefield, a tenant and forester whose life overlaps with a real rebellion. There is a Robin Hood listed on the royal payroll, serving in the household of Edward II. There are regional hardmen, border rebels and dispossessed fighters whose lives echo parts of the legend. Each figure supplies a thread. None weaves the entire pattern. Begin with Wakefield. Robert Hood appears in local roles with a wife named Matilda, then disappears at the moment the Lancastrian Rising collapses in 1322. The timing is tempting. A man tied to forest work suddenly becomes an outlaw when a revolt fails. Afterward, fragments of his life reappear, suggesting return or pardon. Scholars see promise here. A forester fits the Greenwood skills. An outlawry order fits the hunted years. A later reappearance hints at reconciliation. Yet the fit phrase on closer look. Early ballads place their moral world in Barnesdale, not Wakefield, and emphasize a yeoman identity rather than noble disinheritance. The dates sketch a silhouette, but they never fill in a face. Next comes the court servant. A Robin Hood appears in 1323 as a valet and bodyguard to Edward II. At first glance, this seems to invert the legend. Service at court contradicts the image of a fugitive in the woods, yet it matches a recurring motif in the ballads, where the outlaw meets the king, serves briefly, then departs. Records show a lump sum payment the following year, suggesting the service ended cleanly. The echo is striking, but incomplete. A liveried servant at court does not resemble a barnside yeoman sharing food with strangers. The location, status, and intimacy with power strain the idea of a long-running rural campaign against sheriffs and abbots. Other candidates complicate the picture further. A marcher lord who rebelled against King John and operated in border forests resembles a prototype for aristocratic rebellion dressed in outlaw clothing. He fought authority, redistributed gains, and kept loyal companions, yet no record attaches the Robin Hood name to him. His story leans toward high politics, while the earliest ballads focus on middling folk, debt, and roadside justice. The archive itself adds friction. Clark spelled names by ear. Robin, Robin, Robert, Hob. Forms blur together. Surnames were fluid. Men adopted and dropped by names with marriage, migration, or office. Records break. Parchments decay. Years go missing. A man could change labels as easily as a village changed its reeve. Trying to stitch a single, continuous life from scattered entries forces seams that do not align. The legend's mask thrives on mobility. The paper trail resists it. Scholars tend to split into two camps. The composite view sees the legend as an accumulation of lives, borrowing episodes from foresters, rebels, and even royal servants, while preserving a stable moral code. The single prototype view searches for a seed figure whose career shaped the pattern, and whose name, or nickname, spread. The composite case points to the wide spread of dates, places, and social ranks, and to the ballad's focus on conduct rather than chronology. The prototype case points to coincidences that seem too neat to ignore. A Wakefield forester outlawed after a revolt, a royal servant named Robin Hood, who appears briefly and vanishes, a border rebel whose actions echo familiar scenes. Each explanation fits some evidence and strains against the rest. If no single man fits cleanly, that tells us something important. The story appears designed to absorb real episodes without fastening itself to one biography. A forester's skills become Greenwood tactics. A rebel's defeat supplies the logic of exile. A court servant's brief tenure mirrors the motif of royal recognition and release. Each fragment locks into a scene without giving authority a single target to erase. Seen this way, the mismatches are not errors. They are design. The legend keeps a moving center so it can travel. It preserves a recognizable set of tests and outcomes, while letting the mask pass from one phase to another as conditions change. That is why a Wakefield roll, a court payroll, and a border feud can sit side by side without forcing a choice. The candidates populate the background, while the figure on stage becomes an ensemble, large enough to endure and flexible enough to survive. Chapter 6. From Bandits to a Brotherhood. One archer does not make a society. From the earliest ballads, the Greenwood already feels organized. Roles emerge quickly, turning a lone outlaw into something closer to a working unit. Little John appears first. Taller, stronger, the one who tests a stranger's nerve and holds the line when force becomes necessary. Will Scarlet, called Scathlock in older versions, brings precision and nerve, the man who opens doors and solves problems that muscle alone cannot. Much the miller's son supplies local knowledge, carts, fodder, routes, and the quiet logistics that keep a camp alive. Later, Friar Tuck enters from festival culture and popular performance, carrying both a staff and a punchline, and settles into the roles of chaplain, mediator, and quartermaster. The shift is subtle but decisive, from a single bow to a coordinated crew. Adding characters might have diluted the legend. Instead, it sharpened it. Each companion takes on a function that transforms robbery by chance into planned operations. One ranges ahead as scout. Another controls space when negotiations fail. One tracks supplies and routes. Another mines oaths, meals, and morale. With these roles in place, a roadside encounter stops looking impulsive and starts looking procedural. Audiences can follow who asks the questions, who checks the purse, who keeps the tally, and who decides when mercy applies. Picture a meal beneath the trees. Much tends a simmering pot. Shares are counted after the day's take, not tossed at random. A stranger invited to sit is questioned before he touches the bread. If he's poor and honest, he eats freely and leaves better off than he arrived. If he's wealthy and deceitful, the band strips away the lies and recalculates what he owes by their rule. Little John guards the edge of the clearing. Will checks knots and buckles. Friar Tuck offers grace, but also reminds them of their vows. Protect the needy, punish fraud, count the arrows back in. This internal code makes the band legible as a society in miniature. It has rules of entry, penalties, audits, and rituals. Humor softens its sharper edges, while a clear public message remains. This is not chaos. It is an answer to it. That clarity allows the story to scale. A lone hero can amaze. A disciplined crew looks like something a village might quietly support when the sheriff's men ride past. The timeline of the group reveals layers. Little John, Will, and Much belong to the earlier stratum, present when the stories first move from voice to parchment. Friar Tuck arrives later, drawn from May games and stage traditions, showing how performance culture fed the legend alongside written song. His presence lightens the tone and adds a missing role. Someone to mediate disputes, bless deals, and import institutional language into an anti-institutional space. Why did this version spread? People recognize cooperation. A small team with defined roles feels plausible in a world of guilds, tithes, and patrols. It mirrors how real work was done, shared labor, matched skills, and a common pot. The band becomes a parallel commons, enforcing rules for communal benefit rather than extraction. It tells listeners that fairness can be organized, not merely hoped for. Social banditry theory helps explain the appeal. In many pre-industrial societies, certain lawbreakers are read as proxies, who push back when law becomes predatory. That does not deny their rough edges. It explains the approval. The merry men answer abuse with a recognizable process. They do not petition or vote. They run audits on the road and balance accounts by an ethic the village understands. The risk of an expanded caste is dilution. Here the result is concentration. Roles sharpen, ethics harden, and the legend gains a system that audiences can test. Fans can argue whether Will stayed within the rules, or whether Little John went too far. That argument keeps the story alive, because it treats the outlaws as a community with standards, not a blur of violence. This is the payoff. The merry men stop looking like bandits and start resembling a functioning commons built where formal justice failed. They share resources, enforce norms, and convert risk into safety for those the course neglected. Once a crew carries that credibility, it can be drafted into larger stories about rightful rule, national loyalty, and the possibility that even a crown might recognize a Greenwood Code when it sees one. Chapter 7. Tudor Rewrites, From Outlaw to Patriot. Tudor audiences met a Robin Hood who still lived in the Green but spoke the language of courts. Writers and performers smoothed rough edges and inserted elements that made him legible to a state that prized order. Maid Marian appeared as more than a romance figure. She became a moral anchor, embodying loyalty within the band. Chivalric touches polished the yeoman grit. Trials of courtesy, pledges and vows joined ambush and audit on stage. The Good King motif offered reassurance that justice could reside on a throne if the right ruler held it. Within this frame, rebellion was temporary, a stand against corrupt officers, not a challenge to monarchy itself. This raises a puzzle. Tudor authorities feared uprisings, policed speech, and employed informants, yet Robin still danced across pages and parish greens. The answer lies in utility. The legend now shows a ruler who recognizes fairness and pardons the outlaw for service to the common good. It channels anger upward into reform rather than revolt. Audiences could condemn petty tyranny without rejecting the crown. Officials could smile. The story ends with order restored under the rightful hand. In performance, the alignment is clear. Robin meets the sovereign, speaks plainly about abuses, and accepts a pardon that validates his code. He becomes a temporary administrator of justice in the gaps, not a rival king. The pardon marks his acts as service to the realm rather than private gain. From here, the legend travels easily into print and playhouses. The cure for corruption is not breaking the crown. It is exposing bad agents and trusting a just ruler to act. Settings shift to match this polish. Barnsdale's focus on debts and roadside audits gives way to Sherwood, expanding stage spectacle. Courts, hunts, and noble visits weave through the trees. Robes and ribbons appear. The tone changes from ledger to display, yet the backbone remains. Honesty tested, graft rebuked, redistribution perceived as fair. Sherwood broadens the audience, appealing to townsfolk and courtgoers, not just northern commons. Maid Marian strengthens the ethic. She keeps Robin in check, models partnership, and turns loyalty into a moral test alongside archery and cunning. The band's choices now reflect bonds, not just balance sheets. In a world where rulers wanted subjects obedient from conviction as well as fear, Marian made the story morally coherent. Festival culture embraced this version. Parish games favoured clear winners, comic foils, and tidy endings. The Good King scene provides closure. Laughter lands on pompous sheriffs, not authority itself. Print reinforced this turn. Robin as a national hero, defending local fairness until the crown intervenes, sold widely. Anti-corruption patriotism replaced open defiance, keeping the songs alive while giving rulers a hero they could endorse. By adjusting to a regime without losing his core, Robin became a national asset. Tudor polish extended the legend's reach, and once a mask adapts to new faces, it can travel again. Flexibility is not weakness. It is how the system survives. Chapter 8. The Anonymous Outlaw as a Safety Valve. If the name had stayed tied to a single man, the story would have ended with him. A fixed biography pins a target to a date, a county, and a set of enemies who can answer it directly. A floating mask does the opposite. It spreads risk and lets more people see themselves in the role. This is the practical argument for the composite theory. Anonymity works. It keeps censors guessing, frustrates informants, and gives communities a common phrase for a shared wish. Fair dealing in a tight world. Observe how the mask functions when pressure rises. New taxes land, a sheriff squeezes, an abbot steward takes an extra cut at the mill. Any single grievance might stay local. Fold them into a tale with a known outcome, and they become repeatable victories. A rider in green halts a convoy, pays a widow's arrears from a padded coffer. A disguised visitor exposes a corrupt beadle, then restores a poor man's pledge. The scene can travel to another parish with different names, and it still resonates. The mask is portable. The remedy is stable. A single origin narrows who cares. Tie Robin to one decade, one rebellion, one lord's quarrel, and the story ages as soon as the dispute passes. The nameless version ages well because it absorbs new material without breaking. When pressure shifts, from a levy to harsh enclosure, from a sheriff to a monastic landlord, the songs swap props while the code stays intact. That is survival through flexibility, not denial of facts. You see the same solution elsewhere. Cultures under hard rule create good outlaw figures who correct abuses while standing outside office. Irish tales feature a highwayman who takes from wealthy travellers to aid tenants. In the Balkans, a Hajduk bands men into the hills, strikes at overreach, then distributes gifts at a feast. Chinese opera presents a wise bandit who robs corrupt officials and shields villagers. Different languages, different laws, same function. A symbolic fixer operates where courts fail and survives because no single recluse can be hanged to end the story. Convergence suggests utility. There is also a mental side. People rehearse choices in stories before acting in life. A symbolic hero teaches the cues. When does a lie signal fraud deserving seizure rather than mercy? What oath binds a debt? When does loyalty to a companion outweigh fear of a sheriff's cell? Audiences learn where to direct anger and where to extend credit. A named rebel teaches biography. A masked outlaw teaches a method. Communities sometimes put the story to civic use. Parish games stage bouts under the Greenwood name to raise money for the poor box. Contest winners might ransom a mock prisoner, and coins stocked a charity chest. The event wrapped the social code, aid for the needy, restraint for the proud, into a day of sport. No living leader needed naming. The mask signalled, and the funds reached their goal. Entertainment became cohesion. The composite view also resolves the archival puzzle. Diverse exploits feeding the legend over time explain why the name appears across counties in different guises, marking conduct rather than lineage. Singers stabilize tests and outcomes, not a single life. Later writers polish the code to fit new regimes, not to locate a tomb. These patterns match what survives. So what of the title question? It shifts. The hunt for one body under one stone tells less than the pattern of use. Failing to nail a single Robin is not a flaw. It signals the legend's durability. A fixed hero can be tried, hanged, or pardoned into silence. A mask can be lent, borrowed, and worn again as pressure returns. The payoff is clarity. The anonymous outlaw acted as a safety valve, a way to vent, teach judgment, and model fair redress, without naming a leader who could be crushed. That resilience kept the code alive across counties and centuries. Viewed this way, the legend is evidence of system stress and local solutions, carried in song rather than statute. Folklore becomes data, a record of what hurt and how people wanted it fixed. Chapter 9. Reading legends like case files. Treat the legend as a diagnostic tool, and the question shifts from who was he to what did the story measure. Folklore records were pain clusters. It shows which actors drew blame and which acts earned praise. repeating those choices until they feel like common sense. The method is simple. Read motifs as data points. Note who is punished, who is helped, and why. Track when mercy follows honesty and when seizure follows fraud. Count how often authority figures fail the test. When patterns persist across versions, you have evidence of what people consider justice under strain. The catch is that entertainment can muffle the signal. Jokes, chases, and disguises keep the plot alive, but they also risk hiding what the story is measuring. Reclaiming the signal means asking what each scene does as social evidence. When a character laughs while unmasking a corrupt official, the humor oils the gears. It does not change the test. The goal is to separate sparkle from scaffolding, so the underlying rules come back into view. That is where the legend shifts from pastime to record. Start with the forest. It reads as sanctuary because road law felt dangerous to the poor. Cover, routes, and distance from town officers supply safety and time. The motif logs a need for spaces where unofficial judgment can breathe. Disguise serves as counter-surveillance. It lets the weak gather information and flip power without formal warrants. Swapping clothes with a potter or friar tests truth and exposes graft. Redistribution functions as community repair. Money taken from a padded purse pays debts, stocks a table, or secures a bond. The arithmetic is careful because fairness must look procedural, not whimsical. Each motif maps to a pressure already traced. Extraction without recourse meets a portable method of redress. Link those motifs back to the world that shaped them without rehashing cases. Sanctuary answers jurisdiction that punished survival. Disguise answers patrols and officers monopolizing information. Redistribution answers fixed dues and rigid collectors. The motifs give tools where paperwork failed to provide relief and show priorities. Honesty earns credit. Office that lies loses the right to hold a purse. Loyalty binds action. The songs teach a public ledger and make it audible. Later adaptations retain the measuring tools, but overlay new anxieties. When stages and presses move the action into a national frame, a good ruler scene reassures audiences worried about divided loyalty. The legend now tests whether a sovereign recognizes street-level fairness. Debates over levies and state finance bend tails toward clean accounts and pardons that validate lawful taxation while rejecting skimming. In modern spins, the forest motif absorbs green politics. Companies stripping land meet a familiar audit. The trees read as a commons under pressure. The core remains stable. Expose predation, verify need, and make the outcome legible. Use a quick viewer tool the next time a version plays. Ask which pressure this telling is trying to solve. Is the sheriff a collector with too much discretion or a manager of surveillance? Does the churchman represent institutional wealth ring-fenced from scrutiny, or a local landlord overdue for audit? When Robin dons a disguise, what system is he circumventing? Paper walls, cameras, or gatekeepers? When coins move, who gets relief? And how is honesty proven? The answers show which era's stress the story addresses while keeping the old code intact. With that lens, the title question becomes testable. If real means one man with dates and a burial site, the chase stalls. If real means a reliable record of recurring stress in the system, the legend scores high. It logs who communities thought deserved correction and what counted as fair procedure. It preserves a toolkit ordinary courts did not supply and refits it as pressures change. The ballads behave like case files, with findings repeated until they settle into habit. Read the stories this way. and you gain a way to understand other legends too. Not as historical noise, but as pattern testimony about what hurt and what remedies people trusted. Hold that thought as we bring the message home and turn it into a question you can answer right now. Last chapter. Conclusion. The legend holds power because it stays loose on purpose. A mask many could wear made sense when courts served the few. That flexibility let ethics travel while names stayed safe. The code survived by moving through songs, plays, and place names without ever fixing to one body. If a man can be jailed but a story cannot, a hard century chooses the story every time. The outlaw lives in the gaps of authority, teaching lessons about fairness, loyalty, and judgment long after specific actors vanish. The motifs, the forester's sanctuary, disguised as counter-surveillance, redistribution as community repair, carry a portable method of righting wrongs, adaptable to every era. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Robin Hood, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future videos. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought. Which motif stood out to you the most? And who do you think is our modern good outlaw, quietly pushing back against today's pressures? I'd love to hear your take. Share the version of the story that best diagnoses today's injustices. What pressure does it solve and how? Keep thinking of the legend not as a single man, but as a system of ethics that survives through song, story, and imagination. And remember, the mask may change faces, but the code remains.